I think we can go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Real World Evidence in Health Technology Assessments. I'm Benny Turner, Senior Director at Magnolia Market Access. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll explore health technology assessments or HTAs and the critical role real world evidence plays in HTA decision making. As time permits, we will take questions from the audience, so please feel free to add questions to the chat. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Jessica Duchin, to begin introductions.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining us today for our session. My name is Jessica. I'm VP of RWE and HEOR here at MMA. And today I'm joined by my colleagues, Michael Murphy, Director of RWE and HEOR Strategy, and Benny Turner, Senior Director of Value and Access Solutions. Next slide. So the goal of today's webinar is to really explore how HTA-driven decision-making decisions shape global access to therapies and how real-world evidence can support these decisions by addressing uncertainty, informing value, and strengthening market access solutions. In doing this webinar, I learned that saying the word uncertainty is very difficult for me, so I apologize for stumbling over that word a couple of times throughout this webinar. But today we'll provide an introduction into HTAs and HTA decision making, examine why access varies across markets, explore the role of real world evidence, or RWE as we'll refer to it, in HTA decision making, and then we'll close with some key takeaways and implications for US manufacturers. Next slide. And as we dive in, it's really important to kind of remember what our ultimate goal here is and to stay aligned to make sure that what we're doing really has an impact. So despite the fact that there are so many different roles in our world and we all have different individual goals, there's really one shared overarching goal, which is to get patients on the treatment that they need and when they need it. So really access is really at the center of everything we're doing. And across the globe, HTA bodies are making structured decisions about how to allocate limited resources. And those decisions often determine whether, when, or for whom a therapy is accessible. Imagine the exact same drug with the same clinical trial data, the same efficacy, and the same safety profile. But in one country, patients get broad and relatively fast access, while in another, access is delayed or restricted. And the question is, how can the same drug with that same initial clinical evidence have different access outcomes? And ultimately, why does this matter to stakeholders here in the US? Next slide. So as we begin, I think it's really important to understand what are health technology assessments. So at its core, an HTA is a structured evaluation of a medical technology, typically a drug, a device, or some sort of intervention. And the HTA is used to inform decisions about coverage, pricing, and access. And it's a multidisciplinary process that aims to determine the value of a health technology and to inform guidance on how these technologies can be used in health systems. And they inform decision makers about what is known and then what is not known about a technology or medicine, with the goal of creating policies that get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, given the trade-offs or given the uncertainty. And the evaluation broadly looks at three dimensions: clinical value, or how well does the intervention work and for who does it work? Economic value, what is the cost relative to the benefit that it provides? And the broader impact, so including things like unmet needs, severity of disease, and sometimes some societal considerations. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but HTAs are typically conducted by national or regional bodies, such as the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, also known as NICE, IQWIG in Germany, or the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health in Canada. And there's one important clarification that we're going to want to think about as we go through this. HTAs are not the same as regulatory approval. Regulators are asking, is this safe and is this effective? And HTA bodies are asking, is this treatment worth paying for and under what conditions? This distinction is critical because it explains why a product can be approved but still face restricted or delayed access. And then another important point is that HTAs are not purely formulaic. So while many people associate HTAs with cost effectiveness thresholds, in reality, most of these systems combine quantitative analysis, qualitative judgment, and system level constraints. So even when the same data are available, different HTA bodies can and often do reach different conclusions. Next slide. There are multiple HTA bodies around the world, and while they all evaluate value, they do it in different ways. So let's take a look at a few well-known examples. And on this map, you'll see some key HTA bodies kind of by geographic region across the US. But when we take a look at some few well-known examples, in the UK, NICE is probably one of the most recognized. It uses a relatively explicit threshold-based approach, meaning that there's a defined range for what the system is generally willing to pay for given the level of a health benefit. On the other hand, in Germany, takes a little bit of a different approach. IQWIG and the GBA focus more heavily on comparative clinical benefit or how much better a drug is versus existing options or standard of care. And then the pricing is negotiated separately. So instead of a single cost effectiveness threshold, the process is more segmented. In France, HAS also emphasizes clinical benefit, but layers in assessment of the drug's added value, which then influences pricing and access decisions in a more deliberative way. And then in the US or in Canada, we have more fragmented systems. The US doesn't have a global HTA or centralized HTA body, but ICER makes non-binding but influential decisions. And then the AMCP has our dossier framework. And Canada has the CADTH, or in Quebec, a different system. And they incorporate cost effectiveness, but there's more flexibility and deliberation, especially when it comes to uncertainty, unmet need, and broader system impact. So, what are some of these key differences across systems? First, how value is defined. Some rely on explicit thresholds, while others take a more deliberative approach. Second, for different bodies, what matters most in the evidence differs. For some, it's cost effectiveness. For others, it's comparative clinical benefit or added therapeutic value. Third, how uncertainty is handled. All HTA bodies are dealing with uncertainty, but some systems are more risk tolerant, while others require stronger evidence upfront. And finally, how decisions connect to pricing and access. In some countries, the HTA outcome directly determines reimbursement, while in others, it can feed into negotiation. And so, even though these systems are all looking at the same clinical data, they are applying different lenses based on their own healthcare priorities and constraints. And that's a big reason why we can see different access outcomes globally. Next slide. So, important in thinking about the role of real-world evidence in HTA decision making, it's important to understand how HTAs evaluate evidence. So, like we said, these organizations are not reevaluating whether a drug works in a regulatory sense. They're asking, is this drug worth paying for, given what we know and what we don't know? And that second part is really critical because, as you know, we've discussed, and as US payers, as we know with US payers, HTA decisions are not made under a set of perfect information. They're made under uncertainty. Uncertainty about long-term outcomes, about real-world use, about comparative effectiveness or total cost. And in many cases, that uncertainty, not the average effect size, is what drives the decision. So you can have a therapy with strong clinical data that still faces restricted access if the potential population for treatment is broader than the trial, the outcomes or durability of effect is uncertain over time, or the budget impact is unclear. So you can really think of HTAs as a formal process for making decisions under uncertainty. And that's where RWE really enters the picture. And HTAs kind of across the board are considering clinical evidence, so effectiveness versus standard of care, unmet need or safety profile, the economic value, so the cost effectiveness or cost per quality, budget impact, and then long-term value versus short-term costs. patient and societal impact, so quality of life improvements, impact on the healthcare system, equity and access considerations. They're considering the evidence and uncertainties, so the robustness of the data and assumptions made, generalizability to real-world populations, and any risk tolerance. And then they're doing this in light of the context of their healthcare system and policy, so ensuring that it's aligned with national priorities, if it's affordable and willing to pay, and then potential for negotiation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mike to talk about the role of RWE in HTA decisions.
Thanks, Jess. So when we think about where real-world evidence fits in, it's most valuable for health technology assessment when it can address specific decision-relevant uncertainties. And there are several areas where this tends to play out in practice. The first is generalizability. Clinical trials are designed to establish whether the treatment works, but they're often conducted in relatively narrow populations. HTA bodies face uncertainty around how those results will translate to the patients who actually receive the therapy. So real-world evidence can help answer questions like, are outcomes similar in older or more complex patients, or will this treatment be less effective in patients with comorbidities? This is one of the most straightforward and widely accepted use cases for RWE, not establishing the efficacy of the treatment, but addressing how outcomes may vary across patient subgroups and who should be prioritized for treatment. Through registries and longitudinal data, RWE can help refine eligibility criteria, expectations of benefit, and ultimately decisions about who should get access to a treatment. Or, to put it another way, real-world evidence helps define who should this therapy really be for. The next major use case is for long-term outcomes. Clinical trials usually follow patients over a relatively short time period, and this can create uncertainty around the durability of effect. So this creates a major challenge for HTA bodies who need to think about long-term value when the data may not be fully mature. And in these cases, real-world evidence can enable conditional access as data accumulate, and then decisions can be reassessed when data on long-term outcomes are available. Regulators can make ongoing evidence collection a condition of reimbursement, and that allows decision makers to get over the hurdle of uncertainty about whether treatment effects are durable and get to a place where we can see how the therapy performs over time. Another area where RWE can play a key role in health technology assessment is around real-world utilization and demonstrating system-level impacts. Clinical trials are conducted in relatively controlled environments, but RWE helps show what actually happens in practice as real-world utilization can differ substantially from trial conditions with regard to things like dosing, adherence, and treatment duration. And these have major impacts on outcomes and cost effectiveness. Even when a trial establishes clinical benefit, HTA bodies face uncertainty about how it will actually be used in practice. So RWE helps us understand what happens when a therapy is used across the entire population of treated patients. And this is key for decision makers who have to consider system-level budget impacts and to quantify value at scale, not just on a per-patient basis. And the final point here is that the evidence is always evolving. Therapies don't have a single static value proposition. They evolve over time. Indications are added, treatment patterns change, and evidence matures. And so in the same way, health technology assessment is not about making a single decision that stands forever and ever. HTA bodies have to make a series of decisions over time. And so in this role, RWE becomes part of the ongoing evidence life cycle and helps decision makers take an adaptive approach. To think of sort of a unifying framework here, it helps to be clear about what RWE typically does not do in HTAs. It doesn't replace randomized trial evidence. It generally does not single-handedly move the needle, but what it does is reduce uncertainty, refine assumptions, and allow post-launch reassessments. So all of these things can help tip decisions that might otherwise be borderline. But it's always most impactful when it's aligned to the specific uncertainties that matter for the decision at hand. We can think about real-world evidence development as a continuous and iterative process across the development and commercialization cycle. Pre-launch, the primary goal is to quantify the unmet need, characterize what happens in the absence of treatment to establish a credible counterfactual, and define what is currently driving costs and outcomes. At this point, retrospective database studies using claims or electronic health records will usually be the main source of evidence, but patient registries can also be important here. And key endpoints will include things like, basic epidemiological data like incidence and prevalence, resource utilization and costs under current treatment patterns, and event rates that matter for the condition of interest. So depending on what you're studying, this could be things like disease progression, hospitalizations, or mortality. At launch, the primary goal is to make the case for coverage despite any remaining uncertainty or evidence gaps from the trials. So thinking about how trial results will hold up in real-world populations and how durable are the outcomes. This is where prospective studies really start to come into play, possibly through registry-based follow-up or early access cohorts. And key endpoints to think about here are real-world effectiveness as opposed to the trial efficacy, safety in broader populations, real-world adherence and persistence, and patient-reported outcomes. After launch, we need to be prepared to refine the value proposition as HTA bodies reassess evidence and potentially look to expand access by identifying which patients benefit or expanding access through new indications. Comparative effectiveness against other treatments, long-term follow-up studies, and outcomes-based contract evaluations are key here, as are system level offsets and utilization changes. So this is where good real-world evidence can directly inform policy changes, clinical guidelines, and reimbursement. So to kind of sum it up, strong RWE programs start before launch. They're linked to decisions at each stage. You establish the baseline before launch, you manage uncertainty at launch, and then you want to actively shape decisions post-launch. We're going to look at some case studies now of how RWE has actually been used by HTA bodies. And our first case study here is Zolgensma. In this instance, HTA bodies didn't just use real-world evidence, they built reimbursement around it. Just as background, Zolgensma is a treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a rare inherited neuromuscular disorder that results in progressive muscle wasting. It's usually diagnosed in infancy or early childhood, and it results in death without treatment. Now, this drug showed, the gene therapy actually, showed tremendous promise for survival and motor function. But the data were from very small single-arm trials. And with a cost of about $2 million US for a one-time treatment, HTA bodies faced uncertainty about the benefits and value of the treatment. So classic HTA tools like cost effectiveness modeling and indirect comparisons weren't really sufficient for this unique case. And here's where many European countries turn to real-world evidence. They mandated registries at launch as a condition of reimbursement and required manufacturer-supported follow-up studies. Data were collected on survival, mechanical ventilation, motor milestones like unassisted sitting, standing, and walking, and safety outcomes like liver toxicity. Italy took this a step further even and negotiated an outcomes-based payment model. Instead of reimbursing the full cost of the drug up front, payments were split into installments, and continued payment was conditional on outcomes, with rebates or non-payment of later installments if outcome criteria weren't met. So the key point here is that they weren't simply collecting and assessing the evidence, it was directly tied to financial consequences. In other countries like the UK and some of the Nordic countries, they approved the drug conditionally with requirements for long-term follow-up and registry participation. And this is the sort of coverage with evidence development model where RWE enables conditional access while the evidence accumulates to validate the durability of effect and the impact on functional outcomes over time. So we see in this case, it really typifies some of the classic uses of RWE in health technology assessment. Collecting longer-term data on survival, ventilation, and motor function directly addresses the durability of effect. And these were some of the most important unresolved questions from the clinical trials, as well as the longer-term outcomes around safety, where there were questions about toxicity and the unknowns of gene therapy. RWE also provided information on generalizability, as these trials tended to focus on very young infants, but the treatment was approved for children up to the age of 2 in the US, and in Europe it was generally approved by body weight up to about 45 pounds or so. So RWE allowed us to address broader populations treated in clinical practice where the disease severity might vary more widely than the trial populations. So RWE really had a strong impact in this case. In the Italian example, it was directly tied to payment through an outcomes-based contract, and this kind of deal simply would not be viable without real-world evidence. And in other European countries, it allowed conditional access as data was collected and then used to justify ongoing reimbursement. So this shows that RWE can be really powerful when it's mandatory, prospective, tied to explicit decision rules regarding outcomes-based payment, and focused on measurable, meaningful endpoints like survival. The next case study that we want to look at is direct-acting antivirals for hepatitis C. And this case is quite a bit different from the Zolgensma example, where in that case, we were dealing with rare disease and uncertain benefit. But in this case, HTA bodies faced a different problem, where the benefits of the treatment were clear, but the uncertainty centered around the system-level budget impacts and how to best allocate resources. So just quick background on hepatitis C. This is a viral infection that mainly affects the liver. A minority of patients will experience acute infection, but about 70% of those initially infected have chronic disease. Typically, you don't experience any symptoms early, but as the virus persists for many years, it can often lead to liver disease and cirrhosis. And those with cirrhosis can develop even more serious complications like liver cancer or liver failure requiring transplant. So when these DAAs like Sovaldi and Harvoni first came on the scene in the 2010s, the evidence was clear. Over 90% of patients in trials were cured, but the drugs carried a very high cost in the range of about $80,000 to $100,000 in the US. And globally, there were millions of patients who would potentially be eligible for treatment. So the question for HTA bodies was, even if this treatment is cost effective on a per patient basis, can we afford to treat everyone that might benefit? And initially, many health systems responded by restricting access, not because of clinical uncertainty, but because of budget impact uncertainty. So many countries restricted access to sicker patients, such as those with advanced fibrosis. And in some countries, this was paired with things like sobriety requirements or restrictions on which doctors could prescribe treatment. But through national registries and claims-based studies, RWE demonstrated that real-world cure rates matched clinical trial effectiveness in diverse populations, including older patients and populations that had been excluded from trials, such as injection drug users, patients using alcohol, and patients with HIV co-infection. But most importantly for decision makers, RWE demonstrated real-world reductions in liver-related hospitalizations, cirrhosis progression, and incidence of liver cancer. So this reduced uncertainty around the system-level budget impacts and strengthened cost-effectiveness models, leading to the removal of restrictions and expanding access to treatment. By demonstrating lifetime cost offsets, RWE helped change the question from can we afford to treat this to should we treat more broadly. And so we saw many health systems expand access to align with elimination goals set by the World Health Organization, as HTA bodies saw population level benefit, not just cost effectiveness per patient. And so, the real takeaway from this case is that even when there's clear evidence of a drug's benefit, that does not guarantee access. But real-world evidence can provide the justification to unlock access for broader populations. The next example I want to touch on is Orkambi, which is a drug that treats cystic fibrosis, which is an incurable inherited genetic disorder that impairs lung function and in some cases can affect other organs. And patients with cystic fibrosis experience difficulty breathing, frequent lung infections. And while we've seen advances in life expectancy recently in the developed world, it still carries a very high risk of premature death. In this case, we're going to talk about the UK example. It's instructive because it really underscores the point that HTA decisions are not static, and it shows how RWE becomes part of ongoing evidence assessment. So, when the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence first assessed this drug, they saw modest clinical effect from randomized trials, small improvements in lung function, uncertainty about long-term impacts on exacerbations and survival, and a very high cost associated with the drug. So initially, they did not recommend coverage for this treatment. But down the road, there was a breakthrough. The National Health Service and the drug's manufacturer reached a deal to cover the treatment through a managed access agreement. And as part of the deal, patients would receive treatment as data were collected with an agreement to reassess after several years. So in this way, real-world evidence enables conditional access through the promise of reducing uncertainty about the benefit of treatment and becomes embedded in the decision-making process. In practice, the infrastructure to accomplish this was the UK Cystic Fibrosis Registry. This data is systematic, population level, and longitudinal, which allows for the tracking of lung function, pulmonary exacerbations, hospitalizations, and survival. Instead of requiring new trials, outcomes for treated patients were compared to historical cohorts using the registry data, which makes this one of the most robust examples of quasi-experimental RWE in health technology assessment. And the analysis showed positive signals, including reductions in pulmonary exacerbations, stabilization in lung function, and reduced hospitalizations. But again, the effect sizes remained modest, and there was uncertainty around the impact on long-term survival. And so we can think of this as sort of a partial success case for real-world evidence in HTA, but the story has not been fully written yet. But without the commitment to RWE analysis, the drug likely would have remained uncovered in the UK. But the promise of additional data made coverage acceptable by allowing decision makers to say, we'll fund this, but we have to keep learning. And so the lesson here is that RWE is not always going to be transformative, but it can be impactful as a bridge to coverage when the benefit is plausible but not fully proven. And it can support continued access as the evidence evolves by making the uncertainty tolerable enough to justify continued coverage. And the last case study that I want to talk about is disease-modifying therapies for multiple sclerosis. And the use of real-world evidence in this instance is a bit different from the other examples. Rather than supporting access to any one specific treatment, what we're going to see here is how the Swedish HTA body used RWE to inform clinical guidelines and shape treatment decisions. So, quick background on MS. It's an autoimmune disease where the patient's immune system attacks their own nervous system. And symptoms can include things like muscle weakness, loss of sensation and coordination. It can impact vision, like double vision and even vision loss. For a majority of patients, symptoms occur in acute attacks called relapses, but in the progressive form of disease, these neurological problems will remain, and then function will deteriorate over time as the disease progresses. There's no cure for MS, but treatments called disease-modifying therapies aim to prevent relapses and slow disability progression. The challenge for health technology assessment here is that there are many of these disease-modifying therapies on the market, and there's a lot of uncertainty around the right treatment for the right patient, as there have been few head-to-head trials of these medications. Additionally, MS is a long-term disease affecting patients over decades, and trials generally run for only a few years. So HTA bodies have to grapple with the question of which therapies are effective over the long term and for who. In Sweden, they have a multiple sclerosis registry with near complete national coverage and detailed longitudinal data that has been integrated into clinical practice. Clinicians directly enter data during visits, and they capture data on things like relapses, disability progression, and treatment exposure. This high-quality real-world evidence allows for head-to-head comparison of relapse rates and disease progression across therapies and the incorporation of techniques like propensity score matching. HTA regulators then use this evidence to coordinate with clinical societies and create national treatment recommendations around escalation and switching of therapies, and to understand which subgroups benefit from different treatments. This led to the earlier use of more highly effective therapies compared to other countries, where the standard of care tended to use less effective drugs initially and only escalating therapies as the disease progressed. So in this case, real-world evidence was impactful because it allowed for long-term monitoring and head-to-head treatment comparisons when the trial data were lacking, and this directly informed treatment practice. Rather than supporting the approval or rejection of any single drug, RWE becomes part of a continuous learning system and gives insight into how to optimally use a class of therapies. So what all of these examples kind of demonstrate, I think, is that real-world evidence can play different roles depending on the decision context. When there's uncertainty around the treatment benefit, RWE can support conditional access as the data accumulate. When there's uncertainty around whether the treatment works across subtypes or subpopulations not studied in clinical trials, RWE can inform who will benefit. When the benefit of a therapy is clear, but the system-wide budget impact is uncertain due to large populations, RWE can address system-level cost effectiveness. And in multi-therapy settings, RWE can differentiate treatments with head-to-head comparisons. But across all of these, the common thread is that RWE is most influential when it directly reduces the uncertainty driving the decision. And so with that, I will hand it back over to you, Jess.
Great. Thanks for that, Mike. So while HTAs are most visible in countries with centralized healthcare systems, the underlying concept is much broader. So really, why is this important to those of us in the United States? And anytime a decision maker is weighing clinical benefit, cost, uncertainty, and population impact, they are in fact doing an HTA, whether they call it that or not. So while we don't have a formal HTA body, HTA thinking is here. And that's why this topic is increasingly relevant in the United States. US payers are operating under budget constraints, pressure to manage total cost of care, increasing scrutiny of high cost therapies. And as a result, they are making many of the same types of trade-offs. And we can see this in formulary tiering and restrictions, prior authorization criteria, step therapy requirements, or indication level management. In other words, HTA-like decisions are happening. They're just decentralized and less transparent. And then on the policy side, there are also clear signals of HTA thinking starting to enter the United States. Medicare drug pricing negotiation introduces a more explicit focus on comparative value. There is increasing attention to real-world outcomes, utilization, and budget impact. And while the US system remains distinct, the pressures driving decision-making, like cost, value, and uncertainty, are converging with those seen in formal HTA systems. So understanding how HTAs work globally gives you a kind of preview of how these dynamics play out when they are made explicit. Next slide. So I know we've been through quite a few case studies, but here is an example of how HTA thinking is here in the US. So aducanumab was approved by the FDA for Alzheimer's disease in 2021. Their key clinical trial characteristics included a reduction in beta amyloid plaques, limited effect on cognitive improvement, and mixed efficacy results with a narrow trial population. But payers had a different response. They did not have allow for broad access to the drug. CMS limited coverage to patients only enrolled in clinical trials and effectively restricted broad Medicare access, and many commercial plans followed suit. And here, we see a similar example of HTA thinking. So uncertainty of effect, uncertainty of system level impact led to reduced access for patients in the United States. For example, there were a lot of potential patients. Alzheimer's is not a rare disease, and very many patients could have been eligible for this treatment at a high cost to the system with limited evidence of clinical effect. Next slide. So what does this all mean in practice, and what does this mean for manufacturers? The first implication is that evidence strategy needs to be decision focused, not just data focused. It's not enough to generate strong clinical evidence. You need to anticipate what uncertainties decision makers will care about, and how your product will be used in the real world, and what the budget impact will look like. Second, global and US evidence strategies are increasingly connected. They no longer can be treated as completely separate. And third, timing matters. So if you wait until after launch to address key uncertainties, you may already be facing access restrictions that are difficult to reverse, or take a while to reverse as you generate the evidence that addresses those uncertainties. So increasingly, leading organizations are planning real-world evidence alongside clinical development and thinking about subpopulations early, and designing evidence to support real-world decision contexts. HTAs are often viewed as something that happens, somewhere else in Europe, in Canada, in these centralized systems. But what they really represent is a more transparent version of something that happens everywhere. The need to make trade-offs between value, cost, and uncertainty. And those same trade-offs are increasingly shaping access in the United States market. So understanding HTAs and the role of real-world evidence isn't just about understanding other markets, it's about understanding the direction of travel for healthcare decision-making more broadly. Next slide. So I'll close with some best practices for real-world evidence in HTA submissions. First, it's important to align real-world evidence with decision needs. It's important to clearly define the decision problem and the role of real-world evidence. Is it supporting effectiveness, safety, utilization, economic inputs, providing information on a real-world standard of care? Ensure alignment with the HTA body expectations and submission guidelines, and pre-specify research questions, endpoints, and target populations. Secondly, it is important to ensure that the data is fit for purpose. It's critical to use high-quality, relevant data sources such as claims, electronic health records, or registries. It's important to demonstrate that the data is complete, representative, and where the data came from. And in submissions, justify data selection relative to study objectives and the target population. Third, it is important to apply a rigorous study design. It is critical, absolutely critical, to use the appropriate observational design, whether it's cohort, case control, external control arms, because if your study does not have rigorous design with, good methodology, good data, then your evidence is not credible, and it ultimately won't support broader access for an intervention. Comparators need to be defined carefully to reflect real-world clinical practice, and protocol should be pre-registered whenever possible to enhance transparency. Sorry, I'm struggling with words today. Fourth, it is important to address bias and confounding as part of your rigorous study design. So implementing robust methods, conducting sensitivity and subgroup analyses to test assumptions, and clearly communicating limitations and uncertainty where it exists. And this helps to ensure that evidence is transparent and reproducible. So methods need to be documented along with assumptions and any analytic decisions made. Definitions of variables, cohorts, and outcomes need to be clear, and reproducibility should be enabled wherever possible through code lists, protocols, and supplementary materials. Fourth, it is important to integrate real-world evidence into the evidence package as much as possible. RWE should be positioned alongside clinical trial data to address any evidence gaps and to reduce uncertainty. And RWE should be used to inform long-term outcomes, comparative effectiveness, and resource use. We all know clinical trials, tend to be a short window, 12 weeks, a couple months, where you're looking for a clinical effect, and real-world evidence can support evidence on longer-term effect or durability of effect. Additionally, it is important to ensure consistency between clinical, epidemiologic, and economic models, again, to help to reduce uncertainty for HTA decision makers. Fifth, engage as early as possible with HTA stakeholders, seeking early scientific advice or parallel consultation whenever possible will ensure that your evidence package is aligned with their expectations, including on methodological expectations or potential evidence gaps. And it's important to incorporate feedback into study design and analysis plans. And finally, this, is something probably true no matter who you're working with, whether a payer or an HTA body. It's important to communicate impact clearly. Findings need to be translated into decision-relevant insights on clinical or economic value. Uncertainty needs to be quantified and contextualized within the broader results and within the broader evidence package. And implications for patients, payers, and health systems need to be highlighted. Real-world evidence can be highly valuable in HTA submissions, but only when it's clearly aligned to the decisions being made. And with that, we're happy to take any questions and thank you all for joining us. And if you go to the next slide, I can just highlight that our topic next month will be on AI and healthcare research and emerging trends and real-world applications.
Great. Thanks, Jess and Mike. So we've had a couple of questions come in. Before we get into those, I would just like to give a maybe shameless plug to previous webinars we've done, and we have all of our webinar recordings up on our website. I think a lot of what we talked about today kind of interweaves with a narrative we've kind of had ongoing here at Magnolia Market Access of, early integration of real world evidence, HEOR, into the kind of thinking and the nuance around kind of drug launch. I believe our February webinar was on kind of HEOR and payer considerations and kind of incorporating those into clinical trial design. And also, I think it's important to kind of have those stakeholders have a seat at the table. Maybe they're not actively participating as a cook in the kitchen, but they're just kind of planning and knowing, okay, your really highly scientific clinical trial folks are going to go off one way. How do we kind of solve for the real world implications of the choices that they're making? Great. So then to get into the questions, Mike, you mentioned a couple of times that RWE doesn't win, or it's not the needle mover in terms of decisions. So then how would you justify the investment?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's true that RWE rarely wins decisions on its own, but it's important to remember that what it does do is reduce uncertainty to do things like allow conditional access when you might otherwise get an outright rejection, or it could allow for more expansive access when your trial data alone might only justify access in a more narrow population. It also allows you to refine and validate a treatment's value proposition. And so that's going to reduce the risk that payers may want to tighten access or reduce reimbursement in the future.
Okay, great. Jess, anything to add?
No, definitely agreed on that.
Okay, wonderful. So our next question is, how should manufacturers change or adapt what they do or kind of how they're functioning currently based on the information presented?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think what we really need to think about is shifting from evidence generation to decision focused evidence planning. So that means identifying where that uncertainty, oh God, I really can't say that word, will matter the most, and what will matter the most early, and then planning your real world evidence to address those specific gaps. And then kind of finally thinking about budget impact and population segmentation or subgroup analyses from the start. So it's less about generating more data and thinking about how can we generate the right data and then use that going forward.
Okay, amazing. So then for the next question, are there risks in kind of over relying on RWE, especially given kind of, I think we touched a little bit on the variability and kind of data quality?
Definitely. And, there've certainly been cases where HTA bodies, just outright disregard weak RWE evidence. And so you want to make sure that, you have data completeness, methods that address bias and confounding, and also making sure that you're selecting appropriate comparators and endpoints because you could generate valid evidence that's not relevant to the decision at hand. So you want to just make sure you're aligning your strategy to how HTA bodies are actually thinking, and that's how you're going to get the most value out of RWE.
Okay, great. Then kind of digging down a little bit further into that, can you expand a little bit more on kind of the variance in RWE quality and the kinds of information pharma teams may need to be considering or thinking about when they're creating and or managing an RWE plan, especially for the less data-minded folks?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously multiple sources of RWE. When available, if you've got registry data that includes good clinical outcomes that regulators are thinking about, that's going to be a great source. Also, when you're doing a trial, if you have extended follow-up, that can be a good source as well. Um, but really just making sure that whatever source you're pulling from has the outcomes that are going to be impactful for the gaps that need to be addressed.
Okay, perfect. Okay, last question. If you had to pick one mistake that pharma's making in regards to HTA, what would that be?
Yeah, I think thinking of HTAs as like a one-time submission or something you have to do or as like some sort of submission, a box to check is probably the mistake rather than thinking of HTAs as a strategy. By the time you're submitting an HTA, many of the key decisions have already been shaped by the evidence that you chose to generate or didn't generate. So when thinking about success in this area, thinking about HTA requirements early and often and kind of planning those ahead of time and then thinking about it as part of your larger evidence dissemination strategy would be a ticket for success.
Okay, amazing. Uh, Another question just came in. So it's actually two questions. So we'll start with the first. To what extent are HTA entities building in therapeutic competition? They gave the specific example of GLP-1s, generic competition, and disease severity into their models, or do they not care and will just kind of wait it out until the public demands better?
So,
Um,
do you want to take that one, Jess?
no, please, Mike.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so I'm not, I can't speak directly to the specific like GLP-1 examples, but just thinking about how HTA bodies evaluate evidence and sort of their mandate. I think they're going to have to consider generic competition because the question is, what is the value that the treatment is bringing broadly, and so that is going to have to factor in. Um, as far as where it specifically happened, I don't necessarily have that example, but just thinking about, the thresholds for cost effectiveness, it's going to have to come into play at some point.
Yeah. And then are there examples where HTA entities have prioritized small molecules over cell gene therapies with similar therapeutic impact? So not just prioritizing the cost of today, but the fact that eventually the NDAs will go generic. And that might be a specific example that.
Yeah, I don't have that answer, but we would be happy to kind of look into it a little bit further and see what's out there.
Sure. Okay, last one. What is the ROI evidence needed to generate for public and private payers? So one plan year, average time an employer has an employee, kind of what are the thoughts there?
Mhm. A lot of payers in the US tend to think of like price per member um, over like the span of a year. I think that is maybe kind of speaking to that question.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think
So,
yeah, usually they're looking at kind of their per member per month cost for an entire fiscal year.
yeah.
Okay. And then someone asked if the slides will be available after the webinar. The answer to that is yes. And also the recording will be up on the website. So at magnoliamarketaccess.com. Great. Those are all of our questions. Thank you to everyone for attending today and participating and sending in your wonderful questions. We appreciate it, and we will be back next month.